Let's take a look at the internet weather for the last week or so here. And Matt, you were taking a little bit of a look at this one. I think we're still trying to get our head around what might be going on here. But port 4143 and port 4183 UDP showed up. And what are your thoughts?
Well, it's interesting. They showed up at practically the same instant. If you take a look at the graph, you can see that, I mean, the spikes start at the same time. We took a look at the sources, and I can't remember which one is which. I believe that the smaller spikes there are indicative of ones outside of the United States as sources, and the huge spikes are ones that are within the United States. It may just be a question of the vantage point that we have for this traffic. I'm not sure.
I don't know. Looked pretty biased to me.
Okay.
Yeah. So the observation was that in port 4143 that appeared to be predominantly U.S. based, and there were a couple of little exceptions, but you know the geographic mapping for IP addresses isn't perfectly accurate anyway. And then for 4183, it seemed like it was almost exclusively outside U.S., South America and Europe, and Asia. And so I guess that's where it appears that, and the other aspect of this is that it appears that this is P2P activity. Packet size is fixed. It always has an ephemeral port going toward one of these other, these other ports, 4183 or 4143. So my suspicion is, and I guess the other aspect of this, we saw some of the sources that looked like perhaps Internet of Things type devices that were perhaps compromised, a lot of them demonstrating the ROM pager web server. And so that would suggest perhaps that, and that's what, is that the 7543 port?
7547, yeah.
Oh, 47, I'm sorry, yeah, it's 7547 TCP. And so when you have I mean, that's not that popular of a port. If it's showing up on there with a large majority of these items, it's probably associated with that. There was a vulnerability disclosed for ROM pager in December. The vulnerability was disclosed in December, and it was an authentication bypass. So that perhaps is a mechanism or an avenue that's being used here to get into devices, infect them, and I suspect the setting up a peer-to-peer network. And there may be some motivation for the regional separation. And in fact, there perhaps may be other ports that we haven't discovered yet that are covering other regions or some other purpose. So anyway, if you see this sort of activity on your network, you probably want to investigate that a little bit further and see perhaps if it's an indication of this activity having leaked into your network. And Stan, this was the one that you referred to earlier, that is scan sources on various proxy ports, I guess is what we're graphing here, but the one that's really up and on top here is port 8080. You know, we talk a lot about scanning activities, and some of the ones that are shown here, by the way, port 3128 is shown here, 3159, and then 8123. I wasn't familiar with that particular one. Stan, you may, sorry, Matt, I'm calling you Stan again. You were looking at the ports here. I guess you dug up some popular proxy ports to show in this graph.
Yep.
You know, what's actually notable here is in the last week or so, there was actually a pretty significant increase on the number of sources scanning on port 8080, and it kind of feeds into that notion that perhaps a lot of this, or at least some of this scanning activity looking for proxies would be perhaps to help anonymize denial of service attacks. But you know, we're speculating on that particular fact, but there certainly is a lot of scanning activity going on, or a lot of sources doing that. Taking a look at the most probed ports, the top 10 of those, that is, port 135 TCP, still a head scratcher on that one. I guess for some reason somebody has found that to be lucrative, and so they're continuing to scan for port 135, followed by port 22 TCP, 443 TCP, 23 TCP, and then well, I guess it looks like, I just wanted to mention, oh, I guess 443 hasn't moved much. 1900 UDP, that would be associated with reflective denial of service attack activity. 445, that continues to move down, that's kind of a good sign. 80 TCP, and then 8080. 8080 we just taken a look at. 3389, remote desktop protocol, and then 53 UDP. And the other part of the pie seems to be getting bigger, which suggests that there are a lot of other ports that are a significant contribution to the whole here. But keep in mind, it's just the top 10 ports that represents well, roughly 60% of the total. So that's a meaningful observation in itself. Looking in terms of the most sources doing that probing, of course, we had just looked at port 8080 as a part of that, which was a a contributor, but doesn't show up on this graph. And then, well, I guess we're starting to see some growth in the port 4143 and port 4183. Still doesn't show up in this graph, but
4143 does show up.
Oh, it does show up. Yeah, thank you. So 445 at the top of the list, followed by port 23. And so we've been watching the port 23 go down. I suspect it's kind of flattened out here. It hasn't really moved since the last week or so. 27015 UDP and 6881 UDP, both associated with P2P networking activity. We have some ICMP ports in here. 4143 does show up at looks like number 8 there, and then 1900 UDP again, simple service discovery protocol associated with distributed reflection denial of service attack activity.